Welcome. My name is Richard Fallenbaum, and I'm going to be moderating the session today. Welcome to the Sunday morning at the Marxist Library in Oakland, California, the Nebel Proctor Marxist Library. As you know, we have sessions pretty much every week, every Sunday at this time on subjects of Marxism and revolution. We're particularly happy today, privileged to have as our speaker, Eugene Ruyle, who is also essentially the chair of the Sunday morning at the Marxist Library of ICSS, Institute of Critical Study of Society. He will, in his presentation, give a little more detail on his intellectual development. I will just say that he was for many years, his career was a professor of anthropology, most recently at Cal State University at Long Beach. And after that, he moved to Oakland and became active in a number of activities, including Veterans for Peace and ICSS. Please, yeah, thank you. He's going to be basing his talk today on Engels' essay, Socialism, Scientific and Utopian, which I think for many of us, it was the entry drug to Marxism. It's a very accessible outlining of Marxism for beginners. So this should be a very interesting session. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Eugene Ruyle.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Richard, for that generous introduction. For a long time, I've tried to get people to call me General Secretary since I've done the mailings and make the coffee, but people have refused to do that. But thank you very much for that. I appreciate it. And also just one word of clarification. Engels' book was Socialism, Utopian and Scientific. And he talked about the development of socialism from utopianism to a scientific view. And I'm just reversing that because I fear that many comrades, not necessarily in this group, but elsewhere, we can always name some that have gone back to utopianism. So that's kind of the rest of what I have to say here. And I put a pretty long slideshow together, and not a lot of it will kind of be illegible to anybody but me because it's in small text. That was largely for me rather than for you, but I did put big headings in there so you could follow the general aspects of that. Okay, so let me just start. I wanted to go over a little bit of my own intellectual odyssey in search of Marxism, Leninism. And I just want to say I was born in the middle of the Depression to a poor working class family on the wrong side of the Berkeley Hills. And for most of my youth, I just wanted to get out. Happiness was Concord, California in my rear view mirror. And at that time, Berkeley was tuition free since its founding in 1868. So my whole family had gone there, and I was the youngest of 6 children. But I wasn't a red diaper baby like many of you, and I was never tempted to join a disciplined party. So I didn't absorb any party line, but I did join the Marine Corps, which was not the brightest thing I've ever done, but not the dumbest either. And so I survived, and it was after Korea and before Vietnam. And now my line on that is, even though I'm an atheist, I still thank God that she never sent me into combat because bad things happen there. When I got out, I continued my life as an anthropology student at Berkeley, reading some socialist literature. The Weekly People of the Socialist Labor Party had a stand on campus where I could pick up the newspaper. And I took Leslie White's class And Leslie White is known as the only materialist in anthropology and evolutionist for a long time. And he was also a member of the Socialist Labor Party, but not openly so. So my aha movement, I was reading socialist literature and I reported myself as a graveyard, as a guard at the San Quentin State Prison, and did that at night, and during the day I went to classes. And by the spring of 1963, before the Berkeley free speech movement really got started, I was ready to graduate. I had a fellowship to Yale, and I was fairly apolitical, but leaned towards a utopian style of socialism. And after class one day, I was walking down Bancroft Way and stopped to listen to this guy named Lenin on a soapbox, speaking on behalf of the Committee for Narcotic Reform. And his perspective, he's the guy that also wrote a book on the Democratic Party, The Lesser of Two Evils, I think it's titled. But his Marxist perspective made a lot of sense, and I was, following him very closely, very interested. But then the cops busted him on a totally transparent setup. Somebody gave him a beer and he drank it and they busted him. And the guy that gave him a beer just walked away. So I joined an impromptu march to City Hall in protests. And after that, I started to look at things differently. So that was my epiphany or aha moment. And so when I arrived at Yale, I joined New Haven Corps and the Yale Socialist Club, who sponsored Herbert Aptheker at CP USA. And for my stay at Yale, I didn't know how to deal with the contrast between the Marxism of Aptheker and other things. I went down to New York and the SWP's Militant Labor Forum. So I was getting this line, and the other side I had to learn the bourgeois anthropology of my professors, and I just couldn't put the two. It was like it was two different species. And so the Yale faculty sensed that I would not make a good Yale product, so they kicked me out of the program. But they were gentlemanly about it and got me into Columbia, which had a much better department, and was also in New York City. And so I worked as a caseworker for the welfare department and was there for the big welfare strike of 1965, I believe. And I took class with Marvin Harris, who is the author of Rise of Anthropological Theory, or RAT, as it's known affectionately to students, and also a book on cultural materialism. And in there, Harris criticized every theory in anthropology but his own. And he espoused cultural materialism, which was sort of like Marxism, stripped of dialectics and stripped of any political connotations. And I think Harris referred to dialectic as the Hegelian monkey on Marx's back, which I don't disagree with. So then I did continued to do my graduate work, got fellowship to do my field work in Japan, in Kyoto, and I wrote on the political economy of the Japanese ghetto, capitalism and caste in Japan, and worked very closely with Marxists of the Japan Communist Party during that period. And I think I absorbed a lot of what they had to say because Japan is a very mature Communist Party, very strong presence in academia. So that was very productive for me. So then I got a job at UVA and it was intellectually productive. And I wrote a book, Capitalism and World Revolution, at the request of Warner Modules. But then they canceled the entire series and I was denied tenure at Virginia. The dean of the faculty said it was dull, old-fashioned, doctrinaire, and incredibly naive Marxism. And so we had a deal. They would stay and I would leave. So I moved to Cal State Long Beach, a working class school, where I felt very much more at home. And I was paid to teach anthropology and threw the Marxism in for free. I also ran for Congress with the Peace and Freedom Party. So that was kind of my own personal history. As you know, during the social, political, and intellectual ferment, when I
Could everybody mute themselves, please? Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, but that was a period of the war in Vietnam, the civil rights movement, and generally I think this was a time that much of the left arrived at the same view that I had, or I arrived at the same view they had, that the war in Vietnam was a war that US imperialism was waging against socialist Vietnam. And it was understood that the United States was a racist society and that the American people did not support that war or benefit from the war. And so that was pretty much like today. And so I continued with my comrades at Long Beach. We had a little Marxist group organized there, also Peace and Freedom folks. But then the next big trauma for me, I guess, and much of the left, was the global counter-revolution of 1989 to 92. And people were abandoning Marxism. I believe Erwin Silber says, well, now that not only Marxism, but all isms have been proven false and we need to start all over. And that wasn't the view I had. I still had taken a long struggle to learn Marxism, Leninism, and I wasn't about to give it up very easily. So my formulation was that Marx was right in the 19th century. Lenin was right in the 20th century. And our goal in the 21st century has to be to do to Marxism, Leninism, what Lenin did for Marxism. And that remains my view. And I will continue to talk about this. But the basic Marxian principle here is that socialism is not an ideal to which reality is going to have to conform, but an actual process, actual movement, which is transforming the world and contributing to human progress and well-being. And over the past 2 centuries, socialism has developed a variety of forms, most of which have survived the defeats of the late 20th century. So scientific socialism began with Marx and Engels, was further developed by Lenin, but did not stop there. Socialism continues to evolve as a science with the leadership of Stalin, Mao, Deng Xiaoping, and Xi Jinping, as well as a host of others, Fidel, Che, Ho Chi Minh, and others. Okay, so for the outline of my talk, first I want to go over what scientific socialism is. Secondly, I want to look at the global development of socialism. Third, I want to talk about some anthropological perspectives on socialism, focusing primarily on China, which we've talked about before. And finally, I want to talk about the future as anthropology. Okay, part 1. What is scientific socialism? And actually, Wikipedia is a rather good source because that's the only place I found this definition from Proudhon in his book, What is Property? He said that in a given society, the authority of man over man is inversely proportional to the stage of intellectual development which that society has reached. And the probable duration of that authority can be calculated from the more or less general desire for a true government, that is, for a scientific government. And just as the right of force and the right of artifice retreat before the steady advance of justice and must finally be extinguished in equality. So the sovereignty of the will yields to the sovereignty of the reason and must at last be lost in scientific socialism. I think that's a rather interesting definition, but it doesn't appear in Engels or any place else that I know of. So here are the founders of scientific socialism. I'll skip over that. But I also just want to quote this statement from Shea. He says, when asked whether or not we are Marxists, our position is the same as that of a physicist or a biologist when asked if he is a Newtonian or if he is a Pasteurian. There are truths so evident, so much a part of people's knowledge that it is now useless to discuss them. One ought to be Marxist with the same naturalists with which one is Newtonian in physics or Pasteurian in biology, considering that if facts determine new concepts, these new concepts will never divest themselves of that portion of the truth possessed by the older concepts they have outdated. Such is the case, for example, of Einstein's relativity or Planck's quantum theory with respect to the discoveries of Newton. They take nothing at all away from the greatness of the learned Englishman. Thanks to Newton, physics was able to advance until it achieved new concepts of space. And basically, that's been the case in with socialism. Based on the theories of Marx, Lenin was able to re-examine that and refurbish the materialist conception of history and invent and develop the world's first communist party. So I think we need to bear that in mind, that socialism, scientific socialism, is continuing to evolve, but the truths, there are certain truths that are so evident that we don't want to abandon them. Okay, back as early as 1845 in the German ideology, Marx and Engels wrote, "The communism is not for us a state of affairs which is to be established, an ideal to which reality will have to adjust itself. We call communism the real movement which abolishes the present state of things. The condition of this movement result from the premises already in existence." And Engels was a little bit more, talked about this a little further in response to a popular idealist interpretation of communism. And I'll read this. Herr Heinzen imagines communism to be a certain doctrine which proceeds from a definite theoretical principle as its core and draws further conclusions from that. Herr Heinzen is very much mistaken. Communism is not a doctrine, but a movement. It proceeds not from principles, but from facts. The communists do not base themselves on this or that philosophy as the point of departure, but on the whole course of previous history and specifically the actual results in civilized countries at the present time. And he continued to say, discuss how communism developed out of the Industrial Revolution and the conditions there. So let's continue on that. I also came across another bit from the Holy Family. And he says that it is not a matter of what this or that proletarian, or even the proletariat as a whole, pictures at present as its goal. It is a matter of what the proletariat is in actuality, and what, in accordance with this being, it will historically be compelled to do. its goal and historical action are prefigured in the most clear and ineluctable way in its own life station, as well as the whole organization of contemporary bourgeois society. There is no need to harp on the fact that a large portion of the French and English proletariat is already conscious of its historical act and is continually working to bring this consciousness to full clarity. So again, I think the approach that I try to take, which is that of Marx and Engels, I believe, is a scientific one, that we have to look at how the movement is developing. And then the theories people develop have to be explained in terms of that movement. So for example, we need to place theories in the context of the evolving social movement of socialism. So for example, one of the things that Lenin did that was very important was understand the revolutionary potential of the Russian peasantry. That and he didn't cook this. He didn't decide this was what they did, and they need to make the proletariat, the peasantry revolutionary. He could see that this was had already occurred in Russian society. The Russian proletariat was already very revolutionary, already very conscious. That was the first people to translate Das Kapital were the Russians, Bakunin, I think. And it was and they had a long tradition. So what Lenin did was recognize this reality and make it a crucial part of his theory. So I think that's important. And so this was all came to a head with the Communist Manifesto in 1848, which was the founding document of scientific socialism. And in Engels' view, the manifesto transformed the utopian ideal of socialism into a science, but it did so by adding the materialist conception of history and also naming the agent which was going to establish socialism, namely the working class. And this is different than what the utopians had done. For example, when Robert Owen came to the United States he founded a new utopian community. I actually just found there were a lot of utopian communities at that time, and Engels just bought one. The town of Owen just bought one. He was a wealthy man, and it was called Harmony. And so he called his new place New Harmony. But he also had an appearance. He appeared before a joint meeting of the Congress, Senate and House, to discuss his ideas of socialism. So you can't quite imagine that happening at the present time. But the point was, he looked to provide an example that everybody would follow his example, and that the agency which would bring this into effect would be Congress, of course. So that was the distinction between the utopian approach and what was espoused in the Communist Manifesto. And these ideas were not just the brilliant ideas of Marx and Engels, although they were certainly brilliant, but Marx and Engels had been commissioned to write the manifesto by the Communist League, an international organization of workers. And further, within weeks of the publication of the manifesto, the revolution of 1848 broke out. And this was not caused by the publication of the manifesto, but they were both expressions of the times. It was the movement of society that was generating both political action and the ideology that was needed to guide that political action. And then we have Lenin. And let me just take a look here. Someone I trust is keeping track of time. It's 11 o'clock, so I need to start moving. Okay, and Lenin again did the two important things. He recognized the importance of the revolutionary peasants, and hence we have the Worker-Peasant Alliance, which is symbolized by the hammer and sickle there. And also he understood the need for a vanguard party. And let me see. And these were the two foundations of Leninism. And I just wanted to read someone I usually don't read very much of, but I think when he says something worthwhile, we should acknowledge that. And he said, what Trotsky said was, in the year 1917, Russia was passing through the greatest social crisis. One can say with certainty, however, on the basis of all the lessons of history, that had there been no Bolshevik party, the immeasurable revolutionary energy of the masses would have been fruitlessly spent in sporadic explosions, and the great upheavals would have ended in the severest counter-revolutionary dictatorship. The class struggle is the prime mover of history. It needs a correct program, a firm party, a trustworthy and courageous leadership. Not heroes of the drawing room and parliamentary phases, but revolutionists ready to go to the very end. This is the major lesson of the October Revolution. So, and of course he changed his line later on, but that's a different matter. I'm going to skip over some of these things, but I just want to stress that Lenin added something crucial to Marxism. And from that time, as Stalin said, Lenin is the further development of Marxism. It is Marxism in the era of imperialism and proletarian revolution. So I think that's very useful. Now I need to skip over things because, okay, so here is the utopian idea of socialism that I copied this from the Peace and Freedom website, where you have one person talking and espousing these ideas. And people are saying, well, it's a great idea if only other people would go along with it. And basically, and this is a situation we have now. I could put different names on there like Richard Wolff, or the RCP, Bobavakian, who have their utopian visions, but they don't all agree on this. So we have just a mess of different ideas competing with each other, which Engels characterized very correctly. But that's different than the Leninist conception of socialism. In the Leninist view, socialism is a phase in the revolutionary transition from capitalism to communism. It is an objective social global process driven not by ideas alone, but by its own inner dialectics, which can and must be studied scientifically. And as you can see there, we start with capitalism, we have a socialist revolution, and then we have socialism, and where you have, and one of the defining features of socialism is the dictatorship of the proletariat. That's in the first constitution of the Soviet Union in 1918. They linked the two. The Soviet Union is a free socialist society governed by a revolutionary dictatorship of the workers and peasants. So that's the dictatorship of the proletariat. That will last for an indefinite period until finally the state will wither away and we will have communism. And this is derived partly from Marx's critique of the Gotha program, but also specifically from Lenin's interpretation and Lenin's work on that. And he just said the dictatorship of the proletariat is essential because a revolution has to defend itself. It's a life and death struggle between two opposing classes, or the proletariat must have with a stronger class, the bourgeoisie, which remains stronger even after it has been overthrown in one country. So I wanted to then talk about some of the historical Dictatorships of the Proletariat. And let me just, before I go to that, mention this interesting book, Hegel, Haiti, and Universal History, because it's an interesting book. And her point is, if you look at the Haitian Revolution, this is an outgrowth. This is what Hegel based his idea on, the opposition between master-slave. This relationship was at the core of his dialectic. But according to the author of this book, it was never mentioned by Hegel that there was a revolution going on while he was writing his theories. And one could say, well, how could it not be? He read the newspapers every day. He had to be reading about the Haitian Revolution, but it appears nowhere, in fact, just in his theory. And one could say the same thing, unfortunately, about Marxism, that I've done a Google search for Haiti in the Marx Engels Internet archives, and I was unable to find it. And here's one of the major revolutions in human history, the first time the slaves overthrew their masters and established a new state, which, and for which it has been punished ever since. The first foreign aid of the United States government back in the 1778, late 17, while the revolution was going on, they sent foreign aid to the slave owners of Haiti to make sure that revolution would not succeed. So these are, I think much more needs to be said, because that was played a crucial role in the freeing of slaves throughout Latin America and worldwide, and this was against global capitalism at that time, global imperialism at the time. But I'm not the person to write that, but I think it is important that we recognize the Haitian Revolution and its role in history. But the dictatorships of the proletariat, the three that I want to talk about are, first of all, the Paris Commune of 1871. This was a glorious thing, although Marx was not carried out by socialists or by Marxists. Marx recognized its importance, it studied in great detail, and said it would be continue to be felt in the hearts of the proletariat for all time. And as we know, it lasted only 6 weeks, I think. And from this, we get the Internationale that was written after the Paris Commune. But this kind of Marx's work became a model. And then we have the October Revolution in 1917, which we know was a socialist revolution led by the Bolsheviks. And it had a lot of different features. First of all, it established a strong dictatorship of the proletariat, and Stalin proved to be a very strong individual, guiding the revolution through its phases. And let's see. And it was very harsh. But a lot of people looked at this and said, well, their model of a dictatorship of the proletariat, the way we need to do it is what the Paris Commune did. And they had direct elections. Any elected official could be immediately recalled. No official was paid any more than a worker's wage and so forth. And then they judged the October Revolution and what happened with the dictatorship of the proletariat in the Soviet Union by the fact that it was not the Paris Commune. And it's a good thing it wasn't the Paris Commune, because the Paris Commune was overthrown in 6 weeks. The Soviet Union lasted for 70 years. So they were doing something right there. But unfortunately, the 1930, well, at least by 1972, I think that Soviet constitution simply talked about the dictatorship of the proletariat as a thing of the past. And unfortunately, it was overthrown in the Bush Yeltsin coup of 1989. And the next dictatorship of the proletariat I want to talk about is the Chinese Revolution. And many people criticize the Chinese Revolution because it did not behave the same way as the Russian Revolution and the Soviet model. It did not follow that model. But one could say that there was a good thing that it didn't. Because the October Revolution, the Soviet Union was overthrown. Actually, one of the key events was June 4th, 1989, right? Yeah, that was the day of the Tiananmen incident, the Battle of Beijing, I call it. The counter-revolutionaries were defeated there. Unfortunately, they were not defeated, not even recognized, I think, in 1979. And that's the day that Solidarity won an election, which led to the overthrow. So just that we have to understand that this was a progressive development, and the proletariat during this period learns how to rule as a class. And there's some more material in there on socialism and human progress, that a key feature of Marxism is the progressive development of humanity. And if you look back at the time the first socialism was being developed in the 1820s, this was a period, to borrow the words of Anne Feeney, have you been to jail for justice? She says, once unions were against the law, but slavery was fine, women were denied the vote, and children worked the mines. And again, we can see that each of these things, the development of unions, very closely tied into the development of socialism. Slavery, Marx's friends played a key role here in America. The communist clubs throughout the East Coast supported the election of Lincoln, and after the Civil War began, they all disbanded because they all joined the Union Army. The right of women to vote, again, closely tied into socialism. And children worked the mine. And this is one of the features of the Industrial Revolution in both England and America, that the young children, as young as 6 or 8 years old, were locked up in these satanic mills and basically worked to death. Stalin, on the other hand, being a brutal dictator that he was, forced them all to go to school, where they not only learned how to read and write so they could build tractors, drive tractors, and so forth, but they also were forced to learn the classics of Russian and world literature. So the Russian proletariat after World War II was still the best educated proletariat in terms of, they read more books, saw more plays. And it was said that a woman could go to the Bolshoi ballet for 5 kopecks, about a quarter, maybe $1, with or without her husband. So there was an improvement not only in technology, but in general level of culture. And so I have some documents here. Moving slow. We started a little bit late. Okay, the global development of socialism. It's important, therefore, to know that socialism developed through progressively more powerful stages. And I divide these up, first of all, in the 19th century, from the 1820s to 1914. This is the period when the working class was, with the impact of socialism, it was developed. In the 19th century, labor unions were against the law, but there were numerous strikes of the Chartists in England that they working men's movements and parties in the United States developed major unions in the United States and England. First political parties were developed, and Marx helped develop the first international, International Working Men's Association. That lasted for a while. You had the Paris Commune. You had other things developing. You had the Second International developing into a very powerful political party which challenged the Bismarck and the Prussian government and was on the threshold of gaining power through electoral means. But then in 1914, they blew it. They failed to vote against the impending war, and that marked the end of the achievements of 19th century socialism. And it said that after the Reichstag voted in, and the party all voted to support the war effort, it said that Rosa Luxemburg was considering suicide, and Lenin just denied it. He said, no, that couldn't happen. My party could not do that. So it took a while of some weeks of soul searching, but very soon they got back on board with the Russian Revolution in 1917. Let me see if I have more on that. Down here. Not acting quite the way I'd like it to act. And Engels, on the first May Day, mentioned, that he was writing the introduction to an edition of the Communist Manifesto, and he said, things have changed so much. As I look outside my window, I see the whole working class in London and in Paris and Brussels throughout, marching unified as one industrial army. And he says, if only Marx were alive to see this. So there are huge achievements in 19th century socialism. 20th century was, again, and sometimes called the heroic age. This is when you had socialism in one country, which defeated fascism and established socialism in the Soviet Union. And then after the defeat of fascism, you had socialism in many countries throughout the world. And it's said that a majority of humanity either lived in societies that were consciously trying to build socialism, or socialism, Marxism, Leninism, was the dominant ideology of resistance throughout the world. But as impressive as that was, then you had the period of when the empire struck back in 1989 to 1993, what I call the Bush-Yeltsin coup, and the overthrow of socialism, the overthrow of the dictatorship of the proletariat, the overthrow of the proletariat, and the dramatic backward movement in terms of life expectancy fell by 10 years under Yeltsin. And a whole series of bad things happened during that period. But although the Soviet Union did not respond well to the counter-revolution, in China, you saw Deng Xiaoping put down the counter-revolutionaries who were armed, were hoping to incite a coup in Beijing, and fortunately were prevented from doing so. And we can talk more about that if anyone wants to. And now you have 21st century socialism from 1989 to the present, which I insist is not the same as socialism for the 21st century, which is a very movement in Latin America, but 21st Century Socialism, which is a global movement and is currently being led by the Communist Party of China. Okay. Okay, which brings us to part 3. And I have, we started a little bit late, so I think I have a little bit of time, but I'll try to get through this as rapidly as I can. I'd hope to have a couple hours spent on this. Okay, anthropological perspectives on socialism. And here I use what I've called the multiple working hypotheses. We need to look at all the different theories about socialism at the present time, specifically socialism with Chinese characteristics. And first of all, we have what we can call the dominant paradigm, or the Marxist or the mainstream narrative, which is basically comes out of the US and the CIA. Most of the people who espouse this are people like former CIA director. His name escapes me. But you also see it in supposedly left organizations, such as Democracy. If you listen to Democracy Now, that is disturbing, to say the least. Another view, which I found very impressive, is by Andrew Gunder Frank, who developed the idea of the development of underdevelopment. That as capitalism was developing, it was pushing the rest of the world backwards. And he calls this the development of underdevelopment. And Rodney has the book on the development of the underdevelopment of Africa. And I wrote something called Europe and the underdevelopment of China, which, if anybody's interested, I can give you a reference to. So that's another idea, but Frank's view is that if you go back to the beginning of the 18th century, the center of the world economy was in Asia, what we now call the Orient, China, India, the Near East. These were in the forefront of human development. They were most civilized societies, but they were all pushed backwards by the West. And instead of being the most highly developed societies, they became underdeveloped. But he says that this is something that can't continue because you have maybe a fifth or less of humanity in the so-called West, in the developed world, that call themselves advanced, holding down what is essentially 2/3 of humanity. And that's a position that can't endure no matter what, because the Chinese and Indians are not less intelligent or innovative or anything else. They led humanity for most of our existence, and they will reassert in this. And so this is what he calls about the reorient. It used to be the Orient was in the lead, they were pushed down, and now humanity is going to reorient itself. And this is a process which can't be stopped any more than, as you know, the theory of tectonic plates says the east coast of Africa is moving away from the rest of Africa. And this is something we can't stop. It's just going to happen. And I found this very influential. This was written in, I think, in 1990, and nobody talks about it very much. There's a whole series of other views that talk about China as a civilizational state, not the same as the nation states that developed in Europe. In Europe, you had a bunch of states developing, fighting with each other, and very warlike and so forth. But in China, and particularly most workers of this, but I suspect the same is true of India. And we'll have to hear from Raj on that. But the idea is that China was a civilizational state. It incorporated lots of smaller states into it. It was the leader, but it was not like current imperialism. It was ruled by the mandate of heaven, by a set of very enlightened bureaucrats, and under these Confucian ideals. And so it was a best ordered society in the world. And the people who put this forward, let me see. Okay, here's Andrew Gunder Frank, Reorient. One of them is this guy, Martin Jakes, who used to be editor of the New Left Review. He's a Marxist and a British journalist, but he has this book, When China Rules the World, the End of the Western World and the Birth of a New Global Order. And also this fellow, Zhang Weiwei, he talks about the rise of a civilizational state. And he was actually the interpreter for Deng Xiaoping. So I'm assuming he is a member of the Communist Party of China. But he's very, it's a pleasure to watch him talk. He's very grandfatherly, very just kind of, this is the way it is, folks, and so on. And he has a lot of programs on YouTube and urge people to catch him if you can. So this is the idea of a civilizational state, which is different than the kinds of nation states that we have in the West. And we can't understand China as if it were a great power, the way the great so-called self-styled great powers of the West, England and United States act. It's totally different, and one has to understand that. And I think this is very fruitful. I've been strongly influenced by these views. But also I wanted to look at, as an anthropologist, one thing we always ask is, well, what do the natives think? What are the people that we're talking about, studying? What do they think is important? What is their view of their world? And so this is a view from within. And let me see if I can find this other quote. Yeah, this is from no less an authority than this guy with the Council on Foreign Affairs, Wall Street's think tank, as Larry Shoup calls it. He says, for the first time in modern history, we have a communist government poised to be the biggest and most important driver of the global free market. That's astonishing. And we still don't know what makes China's political leadership and Xi Jinping in particular tick. If that freaks you out, and it should, Elizabeth's book, The Third Revolution, is the place to start. And this is another book put out by the Council on Foreign Affairs, which again is a view from the outside and is kind of fits into the mainstream paradigm. So I agree with his diagnosis of the problem, but not his proposed cure. While we have to draw upon the work of mainstream social scientists, we need to recognize that the academic social sciences are all views from the outside, not from the inside. Specifically, they impose Eurocentric Western views on non-Western societies, in this case in particular China. And they also impose the beliefs of only one class within Western society, the bourgeoisie. As such, they are inevitably anti-communism and reject Marxism as a social science. We need a working class social science. We need Marxism. Also, I just wanted to quote Zhou Enlai, who I think everybody shares my admiration for the man. I came across this YouTube where he's being interviewed back in 1965 by some American diplomat. And it's kind of interesting. He's sitting there puffing away on a cigarette, talking to this guy, and basically saying, you know, United States lies, it cheats, it steals, and so forth. Just saying that flat out to this guy. This guy's sitting there listening. But here I caught this one quote. Unlike the US, we do not practice global double tactics. saying one thing while doing another. Ours is a socialist state. We're responsible to the Chinese people and responsible to the people of the whole world. We live up to our words. And I think he is absolutely correct there. Not that that they're perfect societies by any means, but they do live up to what they say. And let me see if so the question is not whether China conforms to our idealist and utopian Western conceptions, but does it conform to its own Marxist-Leninist conception of socialism? And again, not necessarily to the Soviet model, but its own model. And just get a picture of Mao here, because you can see, here's Mao casting his vote in 1953, when China held its first nationwide elections and developed its first constitution. And this was a period when Hong Kong was under the direct rule of the Queen of England. And Chiang Kai-shek had martial law and was repressing the people of Taiwan. So if people say that, you want democracy in China, you want democracy, well, China is the place to get it. Okay, so here, let me just briefly read the viewpoint here of the People's Republic as embodied in its constitution. And you can say, well, this is just a scrap of paper. The Politburo threw it together and so on. That's not the case. The Constitution is revised whenever it needs. It's been revised, I think, 10 times since 1954, the first Constitution. Always the same general principles. And it's done in a process which is basically the largest and most transparent electoral process of history. It's debated by the Chinese, the equivalent of the Chinese Congress. And, they have elections in which hundreds of thousands of people, 700,000 or 800,000, I think more than India. You can't really compare the two electoral processes, but it's the largest electoral process. It's open, transparent, it's debated in Congress and reasserted. So it does reflect the views of the Chinese leadership. And in their view, the People's Republic of China is a socialist state under the People's Democratic Dictatorship led by the working class and based on the alliance of workers and peasants, which is in essence the dictatorship of the proletariat. And if you look at this, this is hard. This is basically the same as the first Soviet constitution. And it's hardcore Marxism here, hardcore Leninism. I thought I was hardcore until I read this and said, well, these guys really have their act together. And they write the leadership of the Communist Party and the guidance of Marxism, Leninism, Mao Zedong thought, Deng Xiaoping theory, as well as Xi Jinping thought on socialism and Chinese characteristics for a new era. And this is, developed in China, which has the largest communist party. Check the statistics, 90 million people, latest statistics, are members of the Communist Party, which is about 6% of the Chinese people. It's supported by the largest labor union in the world, the All China Federation of Trade Unions, which has 302 million people. So again, this is very legitimate, and it does reflect the leadership, view of the leadership of the Communist Party. But we can, as Marx says, we can't just say, well, this is what they believe, this is what Mao says, or this is what Zhou Enlai said, we live up to our word. That may be the case, but we can't, as Marx says, in the preface of the Critique of Political Economy. He says, just as our opinion of an individual is not based on what he thinks of himself, so we cannot judge such a period of transformation by its own consciousness. On the contrary, this consciousness must be explained, rather, from the contradictions of material life. So we need to know what they're thinking, but also how does this manifest it in the actual behavior of the Communist Party of China. And I see we're getting very close. Give me about 10 or 15 more minutes and I'll finish. We started a few minutes late. So if that's okay. But again, I think if you look at a number of things. First of all, the rule by the Communist Party. The Communist Party is indeed a Communist Party. It's not just its name, its actual behavior is in accordance with that. The workers are indeed in control. We see how organized the working class is. But I also want to say, one question as Marxists, we have to say, well, many people think, well, it's really a capitalist society. They've came across this book, the Espresso Stalinist, where they call Mao a revisionist and Deng Xiaoping an arch revisionist. And are these people really revisionists? Well, if we think this is a capitalist society, then it must follow the general law of capitalism. And Marx spells that out, the absolute law of capitalist production. He says, this law rivets the laborer to capital more firmly than the wedges of Vulcan did Prometheus to the rock. It establishes an accumulation of misery corresponding to the accumulation of capital. Accumulation of wealth at one pole is therefore, at the same time, accumulation of misery, agony of toil, ignorance, brutality, mental degradation at the opposite pole, i.e. of the side that produces its own product in the form of capital. And this is universally applicable in capitalist societies, whether we're talking about imperialism as a whole, whether we're talking about United States, England, European countries, this occurs. Is this occurring in China? Well, let's see what Stalin says, because after quoting this general law of capitalist development, Stalin says, is there a basic economic law of socialism? And this is in Economic Problems of the USSR. Is there an economic law of socialism? Yes, there is. What are the essential features and requirements of this law? The essential features and requirements of the basic law of socialism might be formulated roughly in this way. The securing of maximum satisfaction of the constantly rising material and cultural requirements of the whole society through the continuous expansion and perfection of socialist production on the basis of higher techniques. Consequently, instead of maximum profits, maximum satisfaction of the material and cultural requirements of society. Instead of the development of production with breaks in continuity from boom to crisis and from crisis to boom, unbroken expansion of production, instead of periodic breaks in technical development accompanied by destruction of productive forces, an unbroken process of perfecting the production on the basis of scientific techniques. So I think if we look at China and the way that it has lifted so many people out of poverty, clearly indicates that it's not following the capitalist law of accumulation, but rather the economic law of socialism. And of course, I know you won't take my word for it, but the New York Times based itself on the work of the World Bank, which we assume are not are not biased in favor of socialism. We can say this, they put together this little chart here. The red is China. And you see the dramatic improvements, and the line represents the degree of improvement of people's lives, improvement of Chinese living conditions, according to the New York Times. And you see the very poorest people in China, their incomes grew by 200%. The poorest 10% of Chinese, their incomes grew by 10%, 200%. And for the society as a whole, the working class as a whole, they about quadrupled. And whereas so that's the law of socialism being manifested itself. Meanwhile, in America, subject to the law of capitalist production, we see that the poorest 10%, or 10% of Americans, actually their incomes got worse, and even the richest didn't, basically were more or less stable if you were fortunate in this society. So again, you can see that, okay, well, China conforms to the economic law of socialism, not capitalism. So again, we need to keep this in mind. And I have a whole series of things: improvement in living conditions, development of forces of production. It was a product of a world historical revolution. The Chinese Revolution began with first, it took about 4 years. I mean, China had been held down during a century of humiliation, so low that it took 5 years just simply to have the land reform, marriage law reform, and so forth, and develop to the state where it could have a constitution, have elections. And again, there's another nice article I have some hidden away here somewhere, where it's going to talk about, well, if Lenin were dropped down into the heart of Beijing now and started to look around, first of all, he would be amazed by what had been accomplished: the skyscrapers, the high-speed trains, all the wealth and technological accomplishments of China. But this guy says, but if he'd gone to the headquarters of the Chinese Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party, he would have recognized the organization that he founded, because the Chinese Communist Party is built along purely Leninist lines. So I think we need to keep these things in mind. Let me see. Oh, here again, Mao Zedong on Chinese state capitalism. He said, this is back in 1953, the present day capitalist economy in China is a capitalist economy which for the most part is under the control of the people's government and is linked into the state-owned socialist economy in various forms and supervised by the workers. It is not an ordinary, but a particular kind of capitalist economy, namely a state capitalist economy of a new type. It exists not chiefly to make profits for the capitalists, but to meet the needs of the people and the state. True, a share of the profits produced by the workers goes to the capitalists, but that is only a small part, about 1/4 of the total. The remaining 3/4 are produced for the workers in the form of the welfare fund, for the state in the form of income tax, and for expanding the productive capacity, a small part of which produces profits for the capitalists. Therefore, this state capitalist economy of a new type takes on a socialist character of a very great extent and benefits the workers and the state. So,
okay, it's about 11:45 now.
Okay, let me just conclude here with the final thing here. Oh, let's see. No. Just the anthropology of the future. I think if you look again, China being a socialist country, which it says it's ruled by a communist party, the purpose of which is to develop communism, then we have to look to the works of Marx and Lenin for what is a communist society. And the Chinese talk about a moderately prosperous economy. They talk, again, in the Communist Manifesto, they said, in the place of the present society with its classes and class struggles, we will have an association in which the free development of each is the free development of all. And with that happy note, I will conclude and look for the free development of the discussion here. Thank you.
Thank you, Gene. That was a very interesting discussion, and I'm sure we will have an interesting discussion. This is the time of announcements and other matters, business. I want to first mention bring your attention to the fundraising appeal. You'll see in the chat, if you're so interested, is I'm adding in now details on how you can contribute to the work of Institute for the Critical Study of Society and indirectly the Marxist Library. I won't go into details today, but you can see the information. Then I'd like to call on Mehmet to a brief announcement about the exciting new website we have. And then after that, hopefully Gene can give us a preview of some of our future programs. Go ahead, Mehmet, if you're there.
Okay, thank you, Richard. Yes, we are proud to announce that just last, I think Friday or Saturday, Alan was able to make our new website available and come to life. We are really very excited about it. It has much more pictures of things, and you are going to see the past presentations up until January of this year still there. And as these continue, we are going to put more of these presentations, but the previous ones are not lost. They still stay in our older system. Just go to the past presentations, and at the bottom of it, you're going to see the archives. So just click on the archives, and everything that Eugene laboriously put in all these years are still there, so you can access them. So we are looking at improving it more as we go along, but so we are I think working more on it to make it more modern and easy to access. So anyway, thanks for everybody who worked on it, especially Alan spent a lot of time on it, and Roger gave tremendous good ideas and things about it. So, and the others waited patiently. That was the new website. The address has not changed, so the same address you can go in, but this time you're going to hit the new website.
Okay. Thank you, Mehmet. Gene, could you give us a brief rundown on some of our coming programs?
Actually, our coming program next week is Mehmet. And I know he's going to be, I know he's enjoying himself for the next week the same way I enjoyed myself last week. So it's on you now, Mehmet, but you might want to talk about a little bit about.
Well, let's we don't have a lot of time left, so I don't want to spend a lot of time. So go ahead, Mehmet, if you need to have
What is this little bit and no time when it comes to my propaganda? No. Okay, guys, first of all, the basis of next week's talk has been actually covered here by Eugene, and I'm going to be building on it because they go hand in hand. There are a lot of discussions that the scientific socialism is dead, and that now it is the utopian, although the definitions of utopia changes, but how do we do the change is by revolutions. And not only us, when we say we, I mean human societies. Where are the revolutions in the development of human societies? And from a Marxist perspective, how do the feudalism changes to capitalism, capitalism to socialism? These are the topics of next week's program. And if you don't come, I'm gonna send the Politburo after you. So I hope to see you next week in the discussion that Gene started this week. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay. Well, now it's open for discussion. I see a number of hands raised already. Mark Albertson, followed by Laura, and then Yusuf.
Yes, thank you very much. Gene, I enjoyed this very much. It was very informative, very enlightening here. But I do have a question. In fact, I have a number of points, but I'm going to consign myself obviously here to one. Your reference to Robert Owen with New Harmony in Indiana. Now, he succeeded in New Lanark in Scotland. Here he opened up this effort in socialism, and he even to raise the standard of the workers here. He cut their hours from 17 hours to 10. He assaulted infectious diseases, fixed the roads. He even raised their wages and lowered the prices in the general stores. Now that's going to work here. It's not going to work in America. He was done when he bought his ticket to come here. America was founded on economic liberty. Not human rights, not civil rights. The essence of the American Republic was economic liberty. And it didn't make any difference if you owned 10,000 acres or you owned 10 acres, you were part of this growing dictatorship of the landed. And so it's not going to appeal to American socialism because why? There's all this Indian land we can take. We can chart our own destiny. But of course, as America becomes industrially oriented, especially after 1865, when the Hamiltonian notion beat the Jeffersonian notion in that war we call the Civil War. Then things like socialism, trade unionism is only going to grow. But Owens, he didn't have a snowball's chance in hell to get done here what he did in Scotland. None. All done.
Gene, do you want to respond, or should we go on?
Well, no, I just want to say thank you very much. I agree with what you said. And unfortunately, it didn't work here in America. If it works, that's great. But can it become part of a global system? And, I think the Maoists have a pretty good idea, and they haven't succeeded in making a revolution here in the United States either. So, but that's another topic. And unfortunately, although I do have things to say, I'll probably come back and we can address this more further.
Well, just one real quick point, Eugene. Didn't Eleanor Roosevelt try something like this with the miners in 1934 with Arthur Dale?
I will have to check. I don't know. I will take your word for it.
Because that's an interesting development with her in 1934 with the coal miners in West Virginia.
There are those that consider the New Deal form of socialism. Socialism by another name, but that's another question. But thank you. Yeah, I agree.
Okay.
Thank you.
Laura Wells, please.
Okay, I have a couple of questions and I'll ask either two or three of them, but I'm wondering why Cuba is not on that list of revolutions, 1959. And the other is, do you happen to have any examples of like the topics or the stories that Democracy Now! covers in a disturbing way? I mean, I'm sure they exist, but I just wondered if you could give me a couple of examples. And then this is not so much a question, but just the one-party systems that that exist in China and in Cuba. And I forget who said that the minute you've got a second party, you've got a counter-revolutionary party, and you need to have a one-party system. And sort of how does that, you know, I think that's, I can't, it's too fuzzy a question. But the first one about Cuba and democracy now, the second one.
Yes, thank you very much. I agree. Cuba is everybody's favorite socialist country. I think we all agree that what the Cubans have done is miraculous. And you know, I was only been to Cuba once in 1989 for the 150th anniversary of the Communist Manifesto. But I know in one session, one of us North Americans asked the Cubans, well, how can you say you have a democracy when you only have one party? The response was, under Batista, we had 7 political parties and no democracy. Now we have one party and we have democracy. And I think that's the case. And, you know, there's, if you look at China, there's this process. It's not where the party tells everybody what to do, but the party develops a plan, sends it down to lower levels and the people who discuss it, and it goes back up and goes back down a couple of times before decisions are reached. And there's a lot of experimentation, kind of like Proudhon was talking about. You know, it's done scientifically. They try something out, like they tried special economic zones. That was tried out in Shenzhen and a couple other places. It worked real great. So they're expanding these things. And other kinds of things, they try it out in one province, and then it spreads if it's successful. If it's not, it doesn't spread. And that's the way people move up in the bureaucracy. So I think all that needs to be taken into account. And also, another point on on democracy now. I find what that program, their coverage of China, also disturbing in a very different way. It's totally bogus. This is the mainstream approach. It's most of their, one of their leading speakers, a woman named, I have it somewhere, Abbas or something, who's a member of the Uyghurs. She was a spokesperson for Radio Free Asia, which is a US government propaganda. So this is US government, and Amy Goodman doesn't even mention the fact that she's a paid CIA agent. So that got me very upset with her coverage of China, and that continues not only in Democracy Now, but all the mainstream media, many of the left organizations, and I get very upset by this. So yes, there are certain things going on in Xinjiang, and there's a long history there, and that we study carefully. But you know, it's like saying, well, before you start following what she says about you know, China, let's find those weapons of mass destruction. Let's study that first before we go over there. And those incubators for the preemies in Kuwait. Let's look at those. These are all lies spread by the CIA and US. So I just wanted to, I find it very disturbing also.
Okay, Yusuf, you're next.
Say again?
Oh, okay, thank you. One point I'd like to make is the dictatorship of the proletariat is in relation to the state power. Socialism is in relation to the economy. And I think I had given the example before where under Lenin there was the dictatorship of the proletariat, but under that system it was decided to take a tactical retreat from socialism.
Please,
If people can, otherwise I will have to mute people.
Trainen, yeah, thank you.
Okay. A tactical retreat from socialism was made during the new NEP, new economic policy period, and was labeled as a tactical retreat. But it was still a dictatorship of proletariat. So I think that has to be clarified. Second, I take a little exception to, well, okay, we're in the 21st century. We need a 21st century theory of socialism. The examples you gave, Marx and Engels, Lenin, Mao, and I think we should also include Castro, the Cuban Revolution, Vietnamese revolutions, and so forth. Those were theoretical advances done under a period of a revolutionary advance. Now, if you force when a revolutionary advance comes, of course, a new theory will develop, or else it will be missed. But to sort of force people into formulating a new theory during a period of retreat in many ways, and I think one has to admit some of the examples you gave, like I think in China, there's a certain retreat from socialism. I mean, I'm not blaming them, but because it's necessary to develop production, and the Vietnamese party explained themselves as, well, yes, we are not yet socialists, we are building socialists, implying that they had to take a retreat, a tactical retreat. I think that was a better formulation. So I think that's calling for a retreat from revolutionary practice and revolutionary theory. Let the revolutionary situation, objective situation come, and I think a theory should be developed then. But I object to people who sort of artificially call for, okay, we need a new theory, we need a new theory. It's inevitably, most of those come up with retreats from socialism. So I wanted to make that point and get some feedback from you.
Do you want to feedback?
Yeah, let me just say a couple of things. First of all, getting back to Cuba, the reason I didn't include Cuba under the list of dictatorships of the proletariat, I'm not sure they define themselves as a dictatorship. I think they do, but I would have to check that. But also, there's difference of scale. I think if you look at what the Cubans have done, it's fantastic, and probably, I would from my own view, I would like what Cuba's done better than a lot of things. I mean, there are things about China I'm very disturbed by. The Three Gorges Dam, breaking the iron rice bowl, all this consumerism. There's lots of issues in China that I think Cuba has handled a lot of things very well. But Cuba's a very small country. China represents the biggest force in the global economy. Therefore, that has to be the focus. And, should have come to all-out war between Cuba and the United States. Clearly, United States has, 30 times the military power that Cuba does. China, can stand face to face with the United States. And no one knows who would win, but let's hope we never find out. So I think that's the case there. But again, Cuba is a model, but in talking about the global system, and again, as I said, you can't, just like you can't judge the Soviet Revolution in terms of what happened with the Paris Commune, so you cannot judge the Chinese Revolution in terms of what happened in the Soviet Union. They were different. They occurred at different periods. They had different goals and so on. But I don't think the Chinese view what they've done as a retreat. But the idea that there are defects in that society is part of what Engels said, or Marx said. In the first phase of Communist Party, which we now call socialism, defects are inevitable. And the fact that these defects are not, shouldn't deter us. And I have a big long quote from somebody on the issue.
Okay, well, maybe we can go on to some of the other people that, Sharon, Rose, go ahead.
Thank you. I just have a couple of comments. So I was going to say what Gene just referred to. To say that Cuba is a small country is an understatement. They have 11 million people compared to 1.4 billion people in China. And so, whereas for Americans, Cuba might be our favorite socialist place, I think that we really need to look to China for the development of socialism in the 21st century. I'm struck when you tick off the names of comrades who have been leaders in the last 100 years, Stalin and Lenin and Ho Chi Minh and Fidel and Che, and there's not a single woman among them. And I think one of the major mistakes that the Soviet Union did was not to promote women's equality in the leadership. It's not to say that there are no women in leadership. There are a lot of women in leadership positions in the Communist Party in China, for example. I know that because I've talked to a number of women who tell me that, but it's not the same thing as having a spokesperson on a global scale. So I think that should be one of the goals of socialism in the 21st century. So I think what we're looking for is not a new theory of socialism, but what are the reforms globally that we socialists should fight for? And I think one of them should be free trade. And the free trade among the BRICS countries is a model. And I'm not in favor of the dumping of cheap corn on the Mexican people. However, I am in favor of some kind of a good North American free trade. That is to say, tariff-free. And the same thing, I'm in favor of it internationally, globally. And I would like to recommend, you mentioned Proudhon, and Marx wrote a whole book called The Poverty of Philosophy, which was essentially against Proudhon's theory of what he called the philosophy of poverty. And that book is often published with an appendix, which is a speech delivered by Marx about free trade in 1848, which begins with this sentence: "The repeal of the Corn Laws in England is the greatest triumph of free trade in the 19th century." And what he meant by corn laws is not maize growing in Europe. They referred to all grain as corn back then, barley and wheat and everything. And the corn laws were repealed, which meant that there was no longer tariffs imposed on grain being traded. And Marx called that the greatest triumph of the free trade in the 19th century. And he also was very much in favor of free trade, that I think you should read this. people should read that speech. And also Engels wrote an introduction to it later. I think he wrote that in, I forget what year, but it was much later in, I can't find the date, but it was much later. Those two pieces make a very good read. Thank you.
Put that on chat.
Okay.
That's a good suggestion. Put the references, links on chat if possible. The next, I'm going to ask Trayan. Sorry. Go ahead.
No, as you mentioned, the demonization of the Uyghurs by the corporate media here in the West, in the United States, it just reminds me of how they demonized the Soviet Union over the Jewish issue back in the 70s and 80s. Just constant demonization, distortion, lies, getting the population to feel hostile to those countries, and it just keeps going on, and eventually they keep repeating this lie over and over. And I just always think of Joseph Goebbels, that keeps saying the lie over and over, and the public believes it. I find people repeating this now, because the mass media is just going on and on and on with this propaganda, and it's to undermine that country, and also it causes the politicians to vote for, the middle industrial complex, just like what they did for the Soviet Union, to more missiles against the Soviet Union. And now you have the warships going around the Taiwan Strait, the South China Sea, and it's accepted here. One thing about China, it sticks in my mind, even though they have a market economy, but when the recession hit in 2008 here, when everything was collapsing, they didn't have the anarchy. The 5-year plan, they intervened, and because of central planning, and they had growth during that time. I think it dropped down to 6%, something like that. But everybody else was going into the negatives, and that shows you the strengths of having a socialist derived system. But I have a question, and my question is, I subscribe to Beijing Review, and I'm not clear where they're at on their national health insurance. Do they have it, or is it kind of fragmented? I get confused when I read their articles. I'm just not clear. Does anybody have any knowledge on that? So that's my question.
Let's leave that open for anybody who wants to do it. Gene, go ahead. And then Gulden.
First of all, one of the things about China's approach is, you can't do everything all at once. So they said their big thing right now is to develop the economy, eliminate poverty, which they've done, and then they have to develop other things. And I agree that I don't have a clear picture of the healthcare system, although they've been they are paying attention to it. And there's a lot of literature, which I haven't fully assimilated. On free trade, I remember at Seattle, one of our slogans was fair trade, not free trade. And free trade simply means corporate dominated trade. And I think that's kind of one of the issues in India too, that, okay, we're going to do this, we're going to help you out. Well, please don't help us out, they're saying, the farmers are saying. We like the old system where we had some protections. So again, my slogan would be fair trade, not free trade, and that China is not the aggressor in this whole trade war. This has been initiated by the capitalists, by the United States, as a weapon. They've weaponized this to use against China. So yeah, I agree. I agree with the idea. Trade should be free and fair and free trade. But we don't have that in the United States. It's not the system we have now.
Richard, I have been raising my hand through the.
Oh, you didn't put it in the chat.
I did.
Okay, you'll be after Goulden and then Richard W.
Okay.
And then some people the second round. Okay, Goulden.
Hey Richard, this is Gary. For some reason, I can't get my hand up on my screen.
Okay, we'll add you two.
And while you are there, I have my hand up also in the Zoom, but if you can put me too, please. Thank you.
Yeah. Go ahead, Goulden.
Okay, when I was growing up in Turkey in 1960s, 1970s, the government had like very good social health, and you could easily buy the good quality wool, for example, very cheaply. And there was a national health care. You can't find some of the products. There was a limited access to some of the products, and there was no access to foreign imports. Like, for example, little tiny shops, American markets that you can buy a record player. Or, until I left Turkey in 1981, I had bananas only once because they were very expensive. So at that time, we categorized this kind of system as a state capitalism. So why don't we say state capitalism of China in this case, for example? Thank you.
Any response?
Well, I just want to mention on state capitalism, I did read that quote from Mao that, yes, China has a state capitalist sector, but it's a state capitalist sector of a new kind. Basically, that all the 75% of the profits go back into the people. Only a small part of the profits go to the capitalists, and it's controlled and linked in. And the Chinese, they do understand what's going on, and they have tremendous support. People don't understand. The polls indicate 90% support of the Chinese people for their government, compared to like 38% here in the United States. So they have the tremendous support, and the Communist Party is very actively involved. If you look at pictures of, all these people went in to help the people of Wuhan and so forth, look closely at them, they all have Communist Party pins, because the party said, this is our business, we're going to deal with it. So it's very active, proactive party, and I think people have a totally weird conception, a very Eurocentric conception of that.
Okay, let's move on. The next one is Richard W., followed by Gary and Raj and Mehmet.
First off, I wanted to apologize to Raj. I didn't mean to impugn Stalinists. Secondly, just to sort of follow up on what Eugene was just talking about, I think that the Chinese have reserved 4 sectors of their economy for state control, otherwise leaving a large degree of independence for what we would call private entrepreneurs. Basically, one of the contentions between us and them is that one of the sectors that they reserve is the banking sector. And to my way of thinking, I think it's a good thing that they have done that. My question was this: is that I had a couple of questions, but in your presentation, Gene, you talked about that we have to judge revolutions based on facts, or you have to judge it's based on facts, and the implication there is that depending on the movement or the historic condition that you're in, that maybe a fact is judged as positive in one ism, if you will, or one historic period. But that same thing may be different. In other words, I guess historic relativism, I think, is probably what I'm getting at. Could you comment on that, if you would, please? Thank you.
Yeah, just to hit that real quickly. Again, we view things one way. For example, we call it a surveillance state. They're doing all this kind of stuff and so on in China. They're their arch surveillance state and so on. But the Chinese, that's secure. People say you can walk down the street of any major city in China. Your wife can do that at 2 o'clock in the morning. Totally safe. No one has any worry about physical violence on this. This is probably an overstatement, but I'm just saying that's very important to them, and they want security. And I just remember that you can buy anything in China. You can't use cash in China. You have to use these QR codes. And I saw this interview with this woman, discussing this thing. Yeah, it's real cool. If I want to get some sushi, I just, log in with the QR code, and they know what I like. So they just automatically give me what I want. And the Western interviewers said, well, doesn't that worry you? That they have all this information about it? So what? And well, doesn't it worry you that the government might get all this information? They already have it. Well, doesn't that worry you? Why should it? I'm not doing anything wrong. And so that's a totally different attitude about, it's a very tightly controlled society in many ways, but in many ways it isn't. There's lots of open areas, free areas in China that people don't recognize. And I have some slides. There's this woman, Li Ziqi, I think. She was a migrant worker. She didn't like that life. She went back to her home and then started this video blog about, doing anything the natural way. So she, uses rose petals to make her own cosmetics for lipstick, and she cooks all these things. And this has like 50 million followers in China. Plus, I don't know how many marriage proposals. So, there's a lot going on in China we just don't have any access to if you watch things like the Chinese news and so forth. You can get a lot of this. And the other thing is they say, well, you can't get Western TV or you can't get Western internet. They block it. Well, all you need is what they call a VPN, that you can log in from outside. And if you want to get Western commentary, you can. Anybody can do this with a minimum amount of technical expertise. But why should they want to? I mean, they're better informed about the United States than we are about China. But they would rather watch Chinese news than Western news. And there's and it's not hard to figure out why.
Okay, thank you. The next is Gary Hicks.
Yeah. First of all, good morning, everybody, and in particular to Gene. Thanks for the presentation, Gene.
You're welcome.
Now, I just have one thing to say. I actually have a lot to say, but in terms of our understanding of what socialism is about and the various theories and things like that, you started at the beginning, Gene, talking about how we couldn't for the life of us find stuff put out by Toussaint Louverture and the Haitian Revolution. And I would say, first of all, C.L.R. James's Black Jacobs is one good source to look at. Secondly, a lot of what Toussaint did not write in the 1790s and 1800s was more than made up for by the writings of Simon Bolivar, who wrote a lot of stuff during the 1810s, 1820s. And then later on, fast forward about a century, we have Maria Tegui of Peru, talking about different things going on in social society and in Latin America that need to be paid attention to. We, if you want to get poetic about it, there's a poem that covers from the 15th to the mid 20th centuries called Canto General by Pablo Neruda, and there's a couple of very familiar poems out of that one. One of them called The Heights of Machu Picchu, and the other one called Let the Woodcutter or Rail Splitter Awake, which is an open letter to the people of the United States begging us not to allow our ruling class to drag the world into a Cold War in the 1940s. And there's just a whole bunch of stuff. And I'm not saying you didn't cover it, Gene. What I am saying, though, is that for those of us on the screen today, there's enough materials for myself and a number of other people to, start looking up some of these things and, and presenting to people what they come up with. That's all I have to say.
Are you able to post your email address so people can contact you to get those titles and suggestions and so forth? Post it on the chat.
I'll post my email on the chat screen, and I will do that. I will do that right now. Thank you, Norma.
Well, just a technical point.
Can I just say one thing? For Gary, I have some shocking news for him, that not everybody is as well read as Gary. I certainly am not. So I appreciate his contributions, but my point is that I don't think people are generally aware of this. I wasn't until I heard Pierre Lebosset, I think, speak at the Starry Plough. But anyway, thank you. I agree.
I think we're exploring ways to make sort of references more readily available to our participants, and hopefully our new website will make that possible. Next coming up is Raj, followed by Mehmet, and then we will go into the second round. And then we're also pretty close to the end of the formal part of our session. So maybe after Mehmet, we'll go to the informal part. Go ahead, Raj.
Thank you, Gene, for a very detailed presentation, and a good one, but except that I don't agree with you. The thing is, you're defining the job of socialism is to build capitalism. No, job of socialism is to end capitalism. Now, you can have a detour, so that is permissible. That's what Lenin did in 1921, was forced to take that detour. But it ended at 28, okay? And then socialist construction, socialist industrialization took place. China is doing capitalist industrialization of China. It has created now, out of Mao's direction towards socialism, it reversed. It has gone towards creating a capitalist class and a graded working class where a quarter of the population is working on $5.50 a day. And you're telling me 75% of the profits of capitalists are reinvested so the ordinary people live well. No, how can it be $5.50? I know, because I work with workers in India who live in $5 a day. I know what condition they live in. No, so it is state capitalism. But I would say that it is not state capitalism of the old type where capitalist class is running, it's the Communist Party running it. So my question is, once you have generated this capitalist class and these classes, how will you end it? Because it can only go one way as far as I see it. And the idea that 2050 will suddenly have a socialist society and capitalism will be overcome. So my conclusion is you have accepted defeat. You have all those people who are saying this is socialism have accepted defeat, that socialism cannot build an industrial society for workers in which capitalist class is eliminated. That's what you have done. And I think that is the greatest defeat that you are accepting. That is not, look at the pollution problem that is coming from this capitalist development that has happened in China. Can India also move in that direction, and whole ecological balance of the world is going to be ended if India followed the same route, which they're trying to do, Modi and others. They're trying to copy China. So I think what is wrong here is in the entire argument is just simply a defense because of China, because the Communist Party rules it. And yes, I agree, it is not as bad as the Capitalist Party ruling America. But American workers, when I came here from 66 to 89 or 90, if you ask the people, they accepted the capitalist system. They defended it as democracy. So Chinese capitalist development is now so large, employing 2/3 of the people who are being exploited. What you're arguing is the working class is saying we want capitalists to exploit us because it is for our benefit. This is completely putting Marxism on its head. I'm done. Thank you.
Okay. Mehmet, why don't you go ahead and then we'll move.
Yeah, thank you. Again, thank you for a good presentation, Gene. It was very helpful. I think we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of the scientific socialism in its theory next week. So I'm going to leave that part alone. I had questions there. But my question is maybe following up on the questions that were brought here on whether, Chinese is promoting a capitalism by a communist party or vice versa. So, but those are all internal. I mean, internally, China does claim that 800,000 people have been lifted from poverty and so on and so forth. That's fine. That's good.
800 million.
Yeah, but there's also the foreign part of this. As you know, in order to maybe defense, in order to go forward, China is investing all over the world. And this invariably brings China in clash with the existing systems. Even in countries who claim to have socialists in power, let's say like Namibia in Africa. I've been involved in a couple of debates and discussions and actually actions in it, is that when China goes to another country, it has to play by the rules of capitalism. It is trying to, like in Namibia, it's mining for, uranium and is using that uranium. That's why. But during that time, it's getting in conflict with the local workers. And those local workers don't like the way that they are treated. But the company is Chinese, supported by the Chinese government. So where do you take a stand on this? Is it the workers' rights in Namibia that's going to take precedence? Or do we always look at the general big picture of a socialist country trying to get a foothold somewhere in the world? So it does bring clashes or contradictions between a socialist system and the workers elsewhere. I don't know how to resolve this. I'm not, trying to throw this, but I'm myself confused on this. If you can say a couple of things about that.
Yes, if I can, and I apologize, my internet went off for a few minutes, so I missed some of it, the discussion, but I did get the thing about the internal and external aspects. And again, lifting so many people out of poverty, I think, is really one of the key things. But I'd also say, the Soviet Union did a real good job too. Which is better, I don't know. But in terms of the foreign relations, I think if you look at China's foreign relations, they have, first of all, have always respected the sovereignty of other countries. This is something the United States does not do. And they don't make loans to, this business about a debt trap and so forth. That such things have happened. Who's responsible? One can examine that. But I remember one fellow that actually lives across the street from me. He's a political science at San Jose State. And we talked about this, and he says, he's a black guy. And he says, well, you know, China has never enslaved a single African. And that says something about the difference between the way real imperialism works and China, which may not be perfect, but they do a lot of things right. And the other thing is China is now standing up there to global imperialism in a peaceful way. You know, trading with Iran, for example, in spite of the fact the United States has an embargo there, you know, China just says, screw your embargo, we're going to do trade. And they're doing trade on grounds that are mutually advantageous. They're not doing this. I mean, everybody loves Shea. I mean, he was, you know, great internationalist. But China's approach is different. They respect the sovereignty of other nations, and they work with other nations on the basis of equality to work out trades. And again, as Richard pointed out, their banks are not run by capitalists. Their banks are run by the state, and they don't necessarily have to charge interest. They don't have to make profit. They decide social goals that they want to use. And Laura's talked about, you know, need for a public bank of California. Well, you know, China's trade, China's banks are the largest banks in the world. You know, 4 of the 5 largest banks in the world are Chinese, and they're state-run to benefit people. And as Zhou Enlai says, you know, we're socialists. That means we're responsible to the people of China and the people of the entire world. There may be exceptions, there may be problems and so forth. And Marx stressed that, you know, the period of socialism is a period of defects. Defects are inevitable as the working class learns to rule as a class. So I just say that. But thank you very, very much for your comments, and maybe we can bounce back to this one of these days.
Could I jump in for a quick second?
Actually, I would like to go next.
Wait a second. This is a good time to end the formal part of our discussion. So we're going to turn off the recording. Institute for the Critical Study of Society at the Niebel Proctor Marxist Library receives no corporate funding, nor do we have any paid staff. We rely on the support of working class folks that share our commitment to the socialist legacy of Karl Marx. We continue to need funds to meet necessary expenses. Since we can no longer pass the hat at our in-person forums, please send contributions to our treasurer, either online via PayPal or by check. The PayPal ID is ICSS Sunday, SUNDAY, @yahoo.com. And the name is Richard Fallenbaum. And checks may be made out to Richard Fallenbaum and sent to him at 1225 Nielsen Street, Berkeley, California, 94706. Fallenbaum is spelled Fallenbaum. To donate directly to the Marxist Library, send a check to the Niebel Proctor Marxist Library at 6501 Telegraph Avenue, Oakland, California, 94609, or directly or donate online at www.paypal.me/npml. For information, write to npml at marxistlibr.org, and the website is marxistlibr.org. Untitled.org.